And our panel here is going to really tackle what if we have this drug or multiple drugs before 2025, hopefully. Are we ready for this? And if we're not, what can we start to do now, or what are people already doing now to try to set up the infrastructure so that we can really make some big success? So before we start, I just want to ask each of our panel members just to say a few words about themselves.
Tim Ferris, I'm a primary care doctor at Mass General Hospital. I'm Senior Vice President for Population Health at Partners Healthcare, and help to run one of the largest accountable care organizations in the United States, which is this new way of paying for healthcare where the government sets a target for spending for a whole population. We have about 600,000 in the population we care for, and the providers of healthcare are at risk for the cost of care instead of the insurance company. And that has implications for what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. Thank you. Bob?
I'm Bob Oliver, CEO of Otsuka America. Our core therapeutic focus is neuroscience, but we also are oncology, cardiorenal, and emerging in digital medicine. I started my career in 1989 with Johnson & Johnson, Janssen, spent a few years at Wyeth, and have been with Otsuka the last 6.5 years.
Good afternoon, I'm Geoff Huggins. I'm the Director of Health and Social Care Integration at the Scottish Government. I'm a career civil servant. I've worked in health for the last 13 years. I've worked on dementia for the last 13 years. I'm the lead for the European Joint Action on Dementia, the second joint action.
Hi, I'm Phyllis Ferrell, and I'm responsible for the late-stage Alzheimer's portfolio at Eli Lilly and Company. I have a commercial background. I've been in pharma for 22 years, but I have the honor and the pleasure of working with the great scientists at Lilly.
Thank you. So we heard some striking numbers that half the people with Alzheimer's aren't diagnosed with it in their lifetime, and that's in the developed countries. It's probably worse in developing countries, and even those people are diagnosed late. So diagnosis and access seems to be one of the initial challenges. And I wanted to ask maybe Bob if you wanted to first kind of tackle what you think those challenges are and some solutions for patient access if we have a new treatment.
So first, let me just say that about a year ago, we convened a group in Tokushima, Japan, some very great minds. Among them was John Hardy. And we talked about the beta amyloid hypothesis, tau, et cetera. And there was an example given, a case given of two patients, both age 85. At death, there were brain autopsies. And both had tangles. One was symptomatic, one never had symptoms throughout their life. How do you, in a clinical setting, distinguish or stratify those patients? And so I think one of the challenges will be patient stratification. Treating a patient who's a brittle diabetic who also has dementia is not the same as a patient who has MCI or who has vascular dementia versus Lewy body. So I think diagnostics need to be more precise, and the payers obviously are going to have a challenge paying for that. The last thing I'll say on this is our current model, at least in the US, is one of sick care. Treating a patient in the prodromal phase is one of well care. And right now there's incongruency in the existing model and where we're going in the future. And I think those things need to be reconciled.
Thank you. And Phyllis, I know you've worked a lot in groups thinking about this. I'd love to get your thoughts on the patient access challenge.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it actually several times. I was really pleased that it came up before this panel about maybe our system isn't ready, even in the case that you have that regulatory success. And one of my first aha moments was as we were recruiting these studies. And so Expedition 3 recruited a mild population faster than any phase 3 study had recruited. And about half of those patients were in the US, so roughly 1,000 patients. And we were celebrating that it took us 17 months to recruit that patient population. And I remember, of course, I was celebrating with the team, operationally fantastic, but I'm going, why are we celebrating that we found 1,000 patients in the US that have mild Alzheimer's disease when there really wasn't a lot recruiting at the same time. There wasn't a lot of competition. The inclusion criteria didn't have, you could be on meds, you could stay on your meds. And so I kind of started scratching my head and I started digging in, and that's when I realized that we have a real problem. Patients aren't flowing through the system in such a way that they're actually being diagnosed early enough to qualify. And this was in a mild study, so this was an MMSC of 20 to 26. To put that into context for you, the patient that spoke with us today, Brenda, had an MMSC of 16. So when this mental model of someone in Alzheimer's disease is this little old lady in a rocking chair kind of in the corner of a nursing home. So when you're talking about recruiting for an Alzheimer's disease study, even when we were really technically late in the disease, in a dementia phase, people weren't flowing through the system very quickly. And I think that's when we dug in and I said, we've got a real problem, not just in the recruiting trials, but what's going to happen when one of these drugs is available, because you're going to have people identified that are too late to benefit. Disease-modifying agents, earlier the better. And right now, not because of bad physicians, but we're just waiting to diagnose too late.
So why, maybe Tim, you could comment on this since you're a primary care physician. Why are we waiting? Like what this idea of the kind of wait for time, or how is this a challenge in the primary care office?
Well, this may come off as sort of being the skunk at the party, because I'm actually not a glass half empty kind of guy generally, but just reflecting on in my practice, I would say it's one of the most common complaints in a well visit. So I see my patients for annual well visits, and either from the patient or their spouse, anytime after 50, I get frequently, it almost always comes up. And, oh, doc, I walk into the room next door and I forget why I walked into that room. So there's a level of anxiety, and then there's a lot of the complexity of how the problem manifests itself. Any memory, any forgetting of anything becomes a symptom of the disease. And that's how it's reflected from the population in the practice. And I will say that the existing screening tools I find wholly unsatisfactory. So they actually don't do a good job of distinguishing the ones that I can use in my office. And then when I refer to neuropsych testing, the patients come back to me and say, like, don't ever do that to me again, right? And so we're caught between the simple and ineffective and the incredibly complicated and too burdensome for something which everybody is worried about. Absolutely everybody is worried about it. So from a primary care doctor's perspective, you're sort of in a lose-lose situation. And so most of the time it's, well, let's wait and see, right? And that, let's wait and see, is precisely, if I'm hearing Phyllis right, is precisely what Phyllis says, no, we can't do that. We have to have a different solution to let's wait and see if we're going to be upstream of this problem.
So just one thing. So Tim, I can relate to that. There are times I forget where my keys are. I say, oh my God, I have a problem. Someone once said to me, if you forget where your keys are, you don't have Alzheimer's. If you forget what your keys are for, you have a problem. So the good news is I remember what my keys are for.
Well, I actually do have a simple screening test. I asked, what did you have for breakfast this morning? What did you have for dinner last night? And I'm sure that's giving lots of people here, scientists, like...
All the neurologists cover their ears.
But basically, if you can remember that, and I know that's much further progression, you're doing your checks book, are you paying your bills every month, that kind of executive functioning. I just do a few quick tests, because the MOCA does not, the mini mental status exam, they just don't do it.
You don't use the ADOS cog in primary care? How about the CDR sum of boxes?
No, is that a 2-week training for that? Yes.
In your 15-minute visit. We won't ask anyone on the panel what you had for breakfast. So no worries. So Geoff, you've solved some of these issues in Scotland. I'd love to hear kind of what you've done there.
Yes, so when we began to work on dementia seriously in around 2007, 2008, we didn't exactly know how to approach the problem. We didn't know what the experience of people with dementia was within Scotland. We didn't know how they moved through the healthcare system. And so where we started was with diagnosis. We said unless we had a good understanding of who the people with dementia were, then we weren't going to be able to provide the solutions and the services that they required. So we set ourselves a target within Scotland that we would significantly increase the number of people with a diagnosis. And we did some really dull things. We did nothing particularly exciting. We talked to doctors about clinical leadership. We encouraged the value of diagnosis. We provided information about what a general practice might expect to see in terms of the numbers within their area. And we allowed them to sort of consider where they were in respect of that. We used some improvement science. And over the period from 2008 to 2012, we took the figures for people with dementia within Scotland who are diagnosed from around 42% of the presumed prevalence to around 65%. And in the 3 or 4 years since then, we've taken it to somewhere around 70%. And we've done nothing particularly magic within that. It's really been a process of creating an understanding of the value and using that value and some very ordinary change methods to take that through. So it's eminently doable. I think where we're getting to, though, and it comes back to Bob's point, is that we are now needing to stratify within that. So this year we will diagnose 15,000 people in Scotland with dementia, and we will add them to the register. But those are very different people. So when we were looking at this in 2008, 2009, they were people with dementia, but now they're late stage with other chronic conditions, they're early stage, and the policy solutions and the delivery solutions that we have for those people are different solutions. So we need to be able to understand how that cascades through the system. And the learning that we've taken from that is immense, in that if we go back to 2008, 2009, we had no knowledge of the people who were in our acute hospitals. Now we know if you're over 65, there's a 30% chance you have dementia. We know that you're likely to stay twice as long. We know there's a higher likelihood that you'll not leave hospital but will die there as a consequence of being there with dementia. And in the absence of a diagnosis and that ability to tag and track people across the system, we would be unable to build a better care system. So diagnosis is foundational.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about education, and so I guess the question for the panel is that scalable in other countries, and who do we need to educate to really make a big impact? I don't know, Phyllis, if you want to answer.
Well, I think it's kind of like tracking, we call it the patient journey, but I think about it a little bit like you were starting a new manufacturing facility. You wouldn't just start manufacturing, you'd run some projects through there, and you'd kind of identify, where are my bottlenecks, where do I need to adjust the machinery so that this process comes before that process. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a local solution. So I think Scotland's done this wonderful archetype that gives us hope that we can do that. It's a really neat country to get your kind of arms around. They've got the NHS, but they've also got a way that you can put everybody at the table together to solve it. Obviously, that's something, in the US, someone told me that the Napa project had 23 organizations, and it's like 700 pages or something. I don't know. It's just really complicated. So I think what you need to do is you kind of walk that patient journey. There's going to be an education for patients. We talked about brain health, right? So people raise their hand, not because they're afraid or in denial, but raise their hand because there might be some things that they could do right now that'll make their outcomes better. Make sure the primary care physicians know how to handle that patient. Where do they send them next? We're going to have I think Researchers Against Alzheimer's did a review, a kind of a shortcut review of this. We're going to have a dearth of neurologists, if we send everybody on to a neurologist. So, I think we've talked about it today. It's the funnel. You need a cognitive screen of the patients to raise their hand. You need a cognitive screen. Then you need to confirm pathology. And then ultimately, at least today, you probably need to have a clinical trial that you can offer patients. Because we do hear from doctors, why would I do this? What's going to change? And, I say patients have a right to consider clinical trials. And if we're waiting to diagnose them until they have an MMSE of 20 or 19 or 18 or 16, you've taken away their opportunity to enroll in a clinical trial. So I think it's pretty complicated. But I think each of those solutions they're not rocket science. We just have to kind of put all the pieces together.
But I think there are some really interesting behavioral components to this. So our experience was, even in just providing some additional material that the general practitioner could pass on to the patient and their family, change the transaction.
Right.
It's really interesting in that this is a group of this is a behavior that we see with clinicians. This idea that you would identify an illness but not diagnose it for the patient is almost unique across medicine. And in terms of the ability of the individuals to then make choices, to have control and to have capacity is taken away. So in some ways the response that follows from diagnosis is important, but as much because of the behaviors that are embedded within the system as because of what it actually offers in itself.
We hear in market research, physicians will say, I can't make the diagnosis because my staff is not able to handle the questions. They're going to come next. And those aren't questions the doctors are used to. It could be advanced medical directives, it could be financial planning. So these are things that the doctors aren't necessarily prepared for, but the Alzheimer's Association's prepared for those. So do the doctors know where those resources are? Can you do something where the doctor becomes the hero rather than, what Tim's had to face, which is the patient says, please don't take me for a 9-hour set of, cognitive tests. Can you imagine a 9-hour set of cognitive tests? That sounds horrifying if you're cognitively normal. Now you're taking someone who's scared about what's going on and asking to put them through 9 hours of cognitive tests. So there's got to be some things that we can do to make that transaction a little easier for the physicians.
So to the first question, is it scalable? I think yes. To the second one, who do we need to educate? I think all stakeholders. Governments need to understand that there is a societal benefit to treating earlier. Payers need a compelling reason to pay for treating earlier in this sick care model. However, I don't think it can be all comers. That won't be acceptable, which is where patient stratification comes in again. And then clinicians need a compelling reason to treat when someone is asymptomatic and doing that upstream because they're accustomed to responding to people who are having symptoms or sick. And then patients need to be motivated to do something when they don't feel sick. And diseases that are asymptomatic, compliance is awful because people don't have a reason to take their meds. So I think across the spectrum, education is going to be needed and behavioral change is going to be needed at the patient level.
Let's move a little bit to the payment, the kind of the elephant in the room. We've heard from some of the other sessions this idea of maybe pay for outcome or who's going to cover these costs or what the impact. And I know you live and breathe these kind of things, Tim. If you want to maybe deconvolute it for us and give us your thoughts.
I don't know if I can deconvolute it. I can just point out maybe some of the challenges. And yeah, I think it's, most economists believe that the inflationary aspect of healthcare costs are a combination of the payment system, the demographics, and innovation, right? And so demographics, the aging of the population, innovation costs money. We've heard a lot about how difficult it is today. And then the payment system. And the payment system has traditionally, and I'm going to speak about the US, although interestingly, the inflationary tendency in the budgeted systems in the OECD countries, the slope of the line is pretty much the same. It's just that the US is dramatically more than twice as expensive as the UK, but the slope is pretty much the same line. So the problem is universal. And so if you, in the US, the innovators and the payment for innovation has not been generally in competition for the same dollars with the provision of medical care. Those have been two different buckets. That's changed rather dramatically in the past few years. And with payment now going to these ACO models with shared savings programs, interesting things are happening where providers who used to be sort of shoulder to shoulder with the innovators because they weren't on the same, they were supporting each other, they're now actually antagonistic toward each other in these shared savings models because it's one pie, and to the extent that we as a provider system want to have nursing ratios covering the beds at a certain level, and some new agent comes on the market, they are in direct competition for the same dollars. That's never happened before. That's now happening. There are over 600 ACOs in the United States, and that's a really new phenomenon. I will say in the past 3 years, we have paid, my organization, Partners Healthcare, has paid penalties back to insurers for our healthcare trend exceeding expectation, and 50% of our trend was in pharmaceuticals. So our own work did not exceed our targeted thresholds, but payment for pharmaceuticals did exceed, and we, the providers, ended up paying the payers back for something we never benefited from to begin with. There was no profit, there was no margin. So interestingly enough, in the United States last year, more than $2 billion flowed from providers to the shareholders of pharmaceutical companies. That's interesting, right? And I would say that is a sort of a setup for some sort of confrontation, probably.
Yes.
Well, and I just think so that we're really clear, it may not have gone to the shareholders of pharmaceutical companies, it may have gone to the shareholders of distributors. Because I think one of the things that's becoming very apparent now as people are going into kind of the pricing mechanisms is you could have list prices increasing, but actually where it's someone in the middle who's adding on some of the payment for their service of distribution. So I think, this is something that's been talked about quite a bit in diabetes in the US recently, where you're actually seeing the diabetes innovators' receipts go down while the list price goes up, because that rebating process that we use in the US, and I think it's used in other countries, I don't know the systems as well as the US, but that rebating process is happening in the middle, and it's not, so I'm not sure that it goes directly to the pharma.
I think
it could go to someone else in the pharma distribution chain.
Some intermediary.
Somewhere in the
wrong
supply
direction.
chain, right, yeah.
Geoff, do you want to talk about
I think it's a fair point, though, that and especially in Alzheimer's disease, one thing that's very unique for the U.S. is we look more like Europe because we're a single-payer system, because the majority of your patients are over 65. So when you compare that to other disease states where we're used to working with private payers, we're not doing that necessarily as much in Alzheimer's disease. We're a single-payer system here. So I actually think there's more in common with Europe than we normally see with Alzheimer's disease. Yeah.
So I think in Scotland we see a very similar phenomena to what Tim's described. So in terms of the bit of the system that I'm responsible for, it will spend something like £8.5 billion this year. £1 billion of that is pharma. We're expecting that the cost of that will increase each of the next 3 to 4 years by around 6 to 8%. And the consequence of that means we need to take savings out of other parts of the system. So we will take away face-to-face savings. And at the moment, we don't have the ability to look at the equivalency or the benefit of a drug versus a face-to-face. So we at the moment offer post-diagnostic support. We intend to continue to do that to address that question of what after diagnosis. But at some point in this process, we will probably have to begin to make decisions as to which is the better buy. And we don't have the criteria for that. The other challenge is that this is an £8.5 billion budget, which is for CHD, COPD, diabetes, infirmity. It's across the board. And there's a question as to when drugs appear. We might forecast over the next 5-6 years 1 or 2 new significant drugs every couple of years, each of which will be eating into that system ahead of what comes down the track on dementia. So I think we need to play this question about what would happen with a treatment modification drug into a wider context of other drugs as well, in terms of how you actually assess benefit.
That's a real interesting observation. One of the analogs in the US of a new drug pretty much causing a system to almost collapse on itself was Sovaldi. which was curative for Hep C. But the conversations didn't happen early. The product hit the market. It eclipsed $10 billion in its first 12 months on the market. And other therapeutic categories suffered. And every large payer I talked to lamented over the fact that they didn't plan, it wasn't in their budget, and they had to find ways to allocate or redistribute their budget. It was a problem, and everyone suffered. And so I think it's very important that pre-introduction of a disease modifier, that there be conversations early with the payer. There are these discussions around outcomes versus fee-for-service and value-based pricing, which personally makes me a little bit nervous, because value-based pricing depends on who defines value and congruency with that definition. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of that. But I think what's very important is to have an upstream conversation so the proper planning can take place, and the system will be more ready to absorb a new innovative compound.
So just give a question from the audience. So does the commercial market for vaccines have lessons for preventative strategies for neurodegenerative diseases? I don't know who wants to take that from the audience.
It depends. I worked on vaccines when I was with Wyeth and Prevnar, and that was less complicated because the CDC was our largest customer, and the payment structure was very simple. If you're talking about a commercial payer or insurance company, I think it gets a lot more complicated, and you would have the same challenges and hurdles and barriers as any other compound, and maybe even more so. So Prevnar example is not a good one. It was pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So it depends on the distribution of payers, commercial, government versus, in this case, CDC.
I think it also depends on what the technology is providing. Is it, as we say, one and done? I mean, like a vaccine, or 1, 2, or 3. That's a really different pricing and distribution strategy than something you're taking every day as a pill or weekly as an injection. And so actually the vehicle by which it is administered is very important in that calculus. So there's the payer mix, there's the vehicle. It's also really important to understand what is it doing to the specific disease. Is it preventing progression or is it slowing progression? Those are very different scenarios to play out economically, right? So they actually might seem biologically like they're actually very close to each other, but from a macroeconomic perspective, they are really different because one of them is actually going to compress morbidity from an economic term, and the other one is just going to delay morbidity. So the costs will still be there, they'll just be shifted. So it's hard, it's a great question, difficult to answer in the abstract without a specific example in front of you to do the analysis.
I think there's some things, though, that make us hopeful, and Tim was touching on this. We are talking about a single-payer system in the U.S. When prevention is typically difficult in the U.S. when patients are bouncing between insurance policies or insurance companies, right? Because one company doesn't want to pay to prevent because they're not going to have that benefit. And so I think the fact that we are dealing with a single-payer system is helpful in that regard. Certainly Europe has that mentality already. I think the other thing I see in Europe that I'm hoping will pick up in the U.S. is maybe a more holistic look at the costs. So the way the social health care systems are, when you look at Scotland's a great example, but we see it throughout Europe. They are worried about people falling out of the workforce because they're having to care for someone else, you know, so that ability to continue to generate, you know, taxes, you know, from the workforce, right? I mean, that's falling out. They're looking at what kind of care they're having to provide in the long-term care setting and all those kinds of things. And that's one of the big challenges for Alzheimer's disease is the cost is in so many different places in the healthcare system. It could be the cost of someone having to drop out of the workforce to care for a loved one. It could be the cost of that caregiver. We all see the caregiver's healthcare utilization go up as they're caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease. And so actually through IMI2, we've got some public-private collaboration through a project called Roadmap to just try to get our arms around the data sets so that payers actually have what they need to be able to even assess whether the drug is bringing value or not. Right now, those are all in disparate places.
But I guess in what Tim says, there is a real challenge in that if we are looking at a drug that either extends morbidity or delays morbidity, there is the prospect that governments may not want to buy it. In that, having asked for years to find a cure, having funded a cure, being in London where David Cameron launched the G7 commitment, that at the point where a drug becomes available, that it may not meet the criteria that governments say that they can use it. The flip side of that is equally challenging, and research tells us this is the illness that most people fear most. And against that, so there's a really potentially toxic mix there of insufficient effectiveness, real-world economics of people not receiving maybe social care, primary care for 3 years, but 5 years, in addition to the drug costs, but simply and again, almost like a multiplication effect from what we've seen with cancer drugs. So it's really difficult to see how that plays out.
So a follow-on kind of question from the audience related to that is, if we do have a drug that works and it's not covered by the payers, will that have what kind of effect will that have on industry and innovation?
A negative one.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Do you actually
I think it's a great question. I mean, how many times today have we heard that the reimbursement situation is preventing us from innovating on diagnostics? I think we've heard it on multiple of the panels. And I think, we've been really public in saying how disappointed we are that probably the single biggest innovation in Alzheimer's disease, which is the ability to see plaque in the brain, is something that payers have not valued. And as a result, that has kept the cost in a very different situation, because how does the cost go down? Volume, right? I mean, this is a volume business. When you make a batch of a radiopharmaceutical, you make a batch of a radiopharmaceutical, whether you get 1 dose out of that batch or 10 doses out of that batch. And so, there's some other challenges in the distribution chain, but I think there's a lot of, I can't tell you the number of companies, diagnostic companies, that have come to Lilly and have basically said, well, we don't want to take this forward. We don't want to go to the FDA until we know that it's going to be reimbursed. There's a business model. So we actually have had the FDA approach diagnostic companies and say, where's your package? And the company's saying, well, we're not going to bring it in until we know that there's a business model for this. And that's a real problem. We are doing the IDEAS study, together with the Alzheimer's Association and the American College of Radiology, but that's after you get a drug all the way through the regulatory process, and then you end up with a non-coverage decision, and now you're not multi-millions of dollars for, a separate study and a delay of aims of, 5 to 7 years. I don't know about you, but if my husband was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, I wouldn't want to wait 5 to 7 years before he was able to get the medicine. And so I think it's going to be a real challenge if that were to happen.
I'll make a prediction that there would be very few payers who would totally not cover a disease modifier, because there would be such a clarion cry from the public and from advocacy groups that there would be a real problem. So there would be pressure on the system to do it. Now, it may be in a specialty tier, but I think that can be worked around. But then the challenge would be, what would you step through to get to a disease modifier? Namenda, Aricept? I think caregivers, again, would have an outcry. So when you have a real innovative breakthrough, and even though there was a problem with the system with Sovaldi, they still reimbursed for it because it was curative and patients wanted it, and they were willing to pound the table. So if you have patients or their caregivers that are willing to act up, to go back to the HIV days, then I think it puts pressure on the system. And I think the worst outcome will be, it'll be on a specialty tier.
So we have another really hard payment-related question. So since you're sitting next to here from the audience, let's say we have a drug, it's approved, people are getting treated with it. What happens if they have side effects? Who's going to pay for that, and would it affect outcome-based payment model?
Do you want to answer that question? Well, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of how it would be different than the situation now. So I discuss risks and benefits of every time I start a medicine, and there isn't a single medicine that I prescribe where that discussion is not indicated, some much more difficult than others. I do think in this case, if there were, I could imagine a scenario just to maybe build on that to make it a little more exaggerated, a situation where you have a fairly rare but very dramatically devastating side effect, and a lot of people, 96, 97% are not going to get dementia, and 3% are going to have, an acceleration of their, I'm making this up, right? That's just to put in stark contrast, that talk about a opportunity for difficult shared decision-making. That will be a very interesting prospect, because whenever you have discussions, whenever I have discussions with my patients about trade-offs, especially around preventive things, you are trading off, psychologically, it's very difficult to have an informed decision-making process where you're trading off long-term benefits for short-term side effects. Because as Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has shown in dozens and dozens of studies, humans do a really bad job of appropriately valuing the equivalencies of short-term stuff and long-term stuff. And so that I would say that would be a very challenging situation. I don't know if I'm properly extrapolating on that question.
Hey, Geoff, and then Bob?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges it raises from a regulatory perspective is if we treat in the prodromal phase, you essentially change the risk-benefit ratio, because the risk is obvious because the side effects will manifest. The benefit is not obvious because there are no symptoms. And I think in the current treatment paradigm where all comers are treated and there's no obvious benefit, unless you can prove durability of effect and that a person who may become symptomatic in 5 years will not. But how do you prove that? So it's a real challenge.
But I think the other element is it depends very much what the drug is and who it's for, because when we get into dementia and Alzheimer's, we begin to bring onto the table issues of capacity as well, and so the ability to actually make a judgment about side effects or to consent to a treatment which may have different components to it. And ultimately that may be a barrier to the point at which you actually apply the drug, but I think there is a set of issues in there which are different for this group of patients than they will be for other patients. Mm-hmm. And I think that requires a different way of thinking into the process.
Thank you. Good point. So in our last couple minutes, I'd love you guys to think about, just first of all, what are you going to do the day that we have a disease-modifying drug, and what's your hope that actually thinking about these problems in advance is going to do to change our field? I don't know, Phyllis, if you want to start.
Well, I think it's important to note that while we're talking about the tension of having a drug would cause, actually we're in a situation where pharmaceutical companies, payers, providers, we're actually all aligned on wanting the same thing. I mean, a healthy ecosystem doesn't mean that everybody gets the drug. It means that the right patients get the drug at the right time. And that's what the payers want, and that's what industry wants, and that's what a provider wants. So I'm really hopeful that we're having these conversations together as best as we can. Especially in the payer situation, it's a little more difficult to do that, although we're getting some relief. It's considered promotional, so we actually can't talk about it pre-label, which is unfortunate, but we're getting some relief on that. But it all comes back around to the first thing we said, which is about this healthy ecosystem. We need to off-ramp people very quickly. Who are the ones that we really don't need to worry about? That cognitive screen. Only go to the next step with the ones that need it. Only go to that pathology step to the ones that need it, so that the patients that actually get the drug are the ones that are going to benefit. That's what we all want. And I think it's just a matter of working through that kind of that timely and accurate diagnosis and that healthy ecosystem cascade together.
Thank you, Geoff.
So I think you need a framework for choice, in that ultimately spending decisions are choice decisions. So in the absence of a framework by which you can assess the value of a drug versus the value of a face-to-face intervention, until you have that, you can't have the conversation with the public. I do think this is going to be a very difficult conversation. You know, we hope for this drug, you know, particularly for you, Phyllis.
We want this problem.
We want this drug.
We want this problem.
But at the same time, it is going to be remarkably challenging.
So I'll answer it more personally. First of all, I just want to say how hopeful this forum makes me personally. The resolve and hearing the heart of individuals who, after they've failed, having a sense that they've let patients down is very, very heartening. And also the resolve to stay after it and the perseverance to say, we will tackle this. The barriers are high, the road is difficult, but we will do it. And I got to tell you, sitting here today, I believe that it's going to happen. When I left Tokushima a year ago, I was very depressed. But today, you've been the anecdote for my depression. So,
Thank you.
very hopeful.
I guess with my comment is that I would like to associate myself with those comments.
Thank you very much.